Now welcome to another lightning response video, where this time we've got a longer comment, not so much a question, from a former lead duck who brought up some interesting points and that I will try and respond to. And since it is a longer comment, I'm going to break it into pieces. I'm going to read a little bit, respond to it, and then move on. Anyway, they started by saying, "Hey Thor, I don't have so much a question, but I do have an interesting perspective about Star Wars that I've been thinking about for a while. A lot of the controversies over the years have a reoccurring theme of whether someone understands the nature of Star Wars or not. Disney doesn't understand Star Wars, Leslie Headland doesn't understand it, those fans don't understand it, that creator doesn't understand it. I'm sure you're familiar with that accusation getting thrown back and forth by just about everyone at this point." And I will pause there and say that, yeah, I am very familiar with that, and I've certainly made that accusation myself a time or two, and mainly against Disney on the whole, because, as I've said before, I don't think they care about Star Wars, what it is or should be. They only care about how they can make money from it, or they may use it to push an agenda, which I think is what really infuriates some fans. As you're even kind of saying here, or will go on to say, but Star Wars has grown and become something rather expansive, to say the least, and in the process, as I've talked about before, but it's really become something unto itself. Most fans don't want Star Wars to be a reflection of the modern world, for example. They just want it to be a reflection of itself, of what it has already long since established. All the lore, basically. This is also then what people mean when they say they don't want politics in Star Wars. They're just saying they don't want current or modern day politics in Star Wars because they'll kind of stick out like a sore thumb, especially considering we are kind of bombarded with politics on a daily basis. The people who say this are not saying nothing in Star Wars should ever be political or you can't have political themes, because obviously it has before and should be again. It just shouldn't be maybe so specific, shall we say. And so I then think oftentimes when somebody says that this person doesn't understand Star Wars, that's one of the main reasons why. They're saying it because that person is trying to use Star Wars for what they want to say, rather than using Star Wars to say something about Star Wars itself. Again, to be a reflection of itself, and therefore to affirm many of the things it has already said. Not that it can't or shouldn't say anything new ever, but it shouldn't say things that seem to go against those very core messages or themes. That's where people have an issue. I think most fans are rather flexible when it comes to what types of stories Star Wars should or can tell. They're all for doing new and different things. They just don't want them to be a radical departure of what was done before, or again say opposite things. Furthermore, and yeah, I know this one is kind of obvious, but I think a big part of this issue, this debate over what Star Wars should be, is because, well, it's been going on for 50 years now, and you have fans that have come on board at many different points along the way, and they are going to prefer what got them into it over other Star Wars, more than likely. If you were a kid when the original trilogy came out, that's probably your Star Wars, and everything else that comes after should kind of sort of try to be something akin to that. But like I said, that one's kind of obvious, so I will get back to the comment now. And yet, I have the nagging feeling that the people we champion as truly understanding the franchise, mainly George Lucas, Dave Filoni, and yes, even we passionate fans, don't understand it either. I've heard every single authority on Star Wars assert ideas that don't seem to align with what Star Wars really is. Every writer, every director, every reviewer, and every content creator, even my own self. And I mean, I get what you're saying here, but I would argue that if anyone does truly understand Star Wars, it would be George Lucas. It would be the guy who created it. That would kind of be like saying J.R.R. Tolkien doesn't understand Lord of the Rings when he's the guy who sat down and wrote the books, and everybody who has done something with it since, like, I don't know, Rings of Power on Amazon Prime, they get some sort of say on what it should really be when, yeah, they paid for it, but do they really get to decide what Lord of the Rings is? But anyway, if George Lucas has said that this was my intent with Star Wars, or was the message or theme I was going for, or this is how I say the Force works, well, then it's kind of difficult to argue with that. Recently, he even said that I was the one who really knew what Star Wars was, who actually knew this world, because there's a lot to it. The Force, for example, nobody understood the Force. When they started other ones after I sold the company, a lot of the ideas that were in the original sort of got lost. But that's the way it is. You give it up, you give it up. And so, yeah, if anybody in the world gets to say they know what Star Wars is, it should be George Lucas, or at least what his Star Wars was. As he said in his own words, he sold it, and well, legally, what Disney creates these days is their own version of Star Wars. And people can love what they've done with it and call that Star Wars, certainly, because it is. There's also people who love the EU, myself included, and that differed from Lucas Star Wars in some areas, and they can call that Star Wars as well, because it absolutely is. George Lucas owned Lucasfilm at the time and gave them permission to create the books, comics, and games, and so who's to say that is not Star Wars? But anyway, my point is simply that there are multiple different versions of Star Wars, which of course complicates matters, considering that not all of them sort of align with each other. Nevertheless, they are all still Star Wars. Though, again, if anyone knows what Star Wars originally was meant to be, it would be George Lucas. Though again, yeah, it has grown into something else for better or worse, something more expansive. And me personally, and you do not have to feel the same way as I do, but I would like to see Disney try to use Lucas as a bit of a North Star, shall we say. I wish they'd let it guide them a bit more than they currently do, because, as I've said before, I do think Lucas incorporated some important messages in there, and it is kind of sad or disappointing to see Disney kind of abandon some of them. Alright, and now back to the comment. So here's my theory. Star Wars has grown to be such an expansive, immersive mythology that it has surpassed the point where any one person can fully understand what it offers. It is, after all, the biggest franchise in the world, and the only thing more expansive are actual religions and worldviews. In fact, in many ways, it seems to function similarly to a worldview. The only difference being that this mythology is understood to be fiction, at least by the vast majority of people. And this is exactly why some of the arguments in the Star Wars fandom can be so heated, because understanding what Star Wars is, or is supposed to be, is something akin to, in a way at least, like trying to decipher religious doctrine. And I know that may sound a bit silly or crazy, and I don't think many take Star Wars quite that seriously. Again, most fans know it is fictional, of course. I think pretty much all do. But some do feel very strongly about all of this, about what it means, or what the canon or the lore should be, because they have made it a sort of hobby, a big part of their life, potentially. And so many kind of find it annoying, or even a little offensive, or almost like something akin to blasphemy when people think it's something radically different than what they feel it is or is supposed to be. The comment then goes on to say, perhaps it's even arrogant for someone to say that they know what the franchise should be. Cough, cough, Leslie Headland, cough, cough. Perhaps the reason the fandom is so divided is because no one really knows what Star Wars is, yet we continue to call each other heretics. There are some perspectives that are clearly flat out wrong because they contradict the most obvious tenets of Star Wars, but beyond that, it is incredibly nuanced. I think it's worth having some grace with each other for it. And that I agree with, that we should have a little grace and understanding when it comes to discussions on this. I mean, yeah, obviously I take this all rather seriously. Like I said already in this video and have talked about many times before, but I do think there are important life lessons to be had in Star Wars. I do think the Jedi can act as a sort of ideal to strive towards. Not that we should be exactly like them, but trying to be less selfish is never a bad thing. And that is ultimately what the Jedi try to teach us, or what they represent. This idea that we can look beyond the self, and that there is a greater good that we should try to pay attention to. And so when I see things trying to tear down the Jedi, when George Lucas himself has said they are the most moral people in the entire galaxy, well, I find it a bit annoying. Which isn't to say you can't ever have a story about wayward Jedi, but in The Acolyte, for example, we seem to have it implied that Yoda, of all Jedi, is about to be a part of a massive cover-up that will, in some respect, ultimately lead to the destruction of the Jedi Order. Problem is, and I think this has come about because Star Wars is so massive and many people care a great deal about the details. They really like to get into the nuts and bolts of, well, pretty much everything Star Wars. And so some people don't really care so much about what Star Wars is actually trying to say. They don't care about the themes or what we should maybe try to learn from it. For them, it has become something more like a history or historical fact, and whatever we learn simply becomes the new truth of the galaxy. For example, again in the Acolyte, I don't think the Jedi should be shown having this giant cover-up because I think it goes against what the story of Star Wars is really trying to say. And again, I think that is an important message. I do think the Jedi represent an ideal, and so I'm not a huge fan of the ideal being torn down for the sake of this one story. But others will be like, well, that's now the truth that is being uncovered, and with this new information, the Jedi Order, what I think of them, has changed, which is, again, really what I don't want to see happen. And this then takes us to the next part of the comment. Was the original Jedi Order good, flawed, or wrong? Do gray Jedi exist? Was Anakin a sinner or a victim? What role should emotions play in our decision-making? Is violence or revenge ever justified, etc.? Ultimately, the answer to those questions comes down to how the mythology of Star Wars intersects your worldview. I am by no means a relativist, but this conclusion seems more and more plausible to me as time goes on. Maybe I'm just abusing the Hey Thor system to voice my own opinion, like I've done in the past, but I thought you might find this line of thinking interesting. Do with it as you like, sorry for the wall of text. And you're certainly not wrong here. A lot of how you see Star Wars or what you think it should be does depend on your worldview, which is kind of interesting because I think Lucas was trying to present you or us with his own sort of worldview or a philosophy or a set of beliefs with Star Wars. In other words, I don't think he was making something that he wanted to be, shall we say, open to interpretation. Rather, he was saying, this is the way I think people are. When they become overly selfish and can't let go, they ultimately end up going to the dark side and making themselves and everyone around them miserable. Again, this is why I see the Jedi as an ideal, because their way, or trying to take some lessons away from their way, will help you avoid being miserable in life or consumed by materialistic things and maybe missing out on what Lucas at least feels like is the point of life. And yes, there are, of course, many, many other points made in there as well. Some of them, like in the prequels, are about how quickly and easily democracies can fall. In other words, he was trying to make a point about many different things. He wasn't really trying to get you to ask yourself if the Jedi are really the bad guys in all of this. But anyway, here to wrap this up, I do agree with most of what you're saying here. I think when something has gone on for as long as Star Wars has now, one that has many different jumping on points and even different iterations, it is impossible to truly agree on what Star Wars is or should be, which is why I think the only thing Disney can really do at this point is to move it into a whole new era. Like I was talking about in a video the other day, move it thousands of years in the future and keep those core tenets that you talked about, that most all Star Wars fans will agree are there or are supposed to be there, and then, for better or worse, depending on how it all turns out, Disney kind of makes Star Wars their own. It gives us their own version of Star Wars instead of just giving us shows and movies that tread upon what has already been done in the franchise or tries to fill in blanks or gaps and then kind of recontextualizes characters and stories, which is what fans seem to be annoyed with the most. Most of the arguments or most of the complaints when it comes to Disney Star Wars is that you are treading over and trampling over what has been done before. And so their best bet, I think, is to really just give us all new characters and stories in a whole different time period that, again, somehow tries to capture the spirit of Star Wars, whatever that exactly is. It tries to capture the things that, again, most of us fans agree with what it should be. Because I do think there is, if you boil it down, I do think, or hopefully I think, there is a sort of consensus in there about what good Star Wars should be. It's all the details around it that we maybe don't agree on. So again, I think starting in a new place, keeping the core ideas intact, is their best bet. Well, that is all I got for you this time. And now I'd love to hear what you all think about this comment or what I had to say about the comment. Do you agree? Do you disagree? And what do you think Star Wars needs to do to move forward? or you can always ask a question for a future lightning response video. All you got to do is start your comment off with "Hey Thor" and then ask away. But whatever you choose to do, leave a comment below. Let's talk some Star Wars. And until next time, thanks for watching.